All right, can you see that?
1 second. I just obviously navigated away for a second because,
That's okay.
yeah, that looks good.
Okay, cool. Okay. I think I'm gonna sprint to the bathroom real quick if you're
Yeah, no
fine
problem.
hanging out. All right, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
I had your links pulled up and now I don't know where they are, so we're gonna find them.
Okay, I can probably resend the document
Yeah,
if
it's all right. I'll just pull them up. Computer's a little bit slow, getting like
you.
low bandwidth or something. It
Yeah.
should be fine. I got it.
Okay. Hopefully we get a good turnout like we had last week.
Yeah. Although at least for us, this is like the last week. Oh no, yeah, the school starts the middle of next week, so
Mm,
that can be
yeah.
challenging. There's all this stuff. My computer's not trying to do 10,000 things.
Mhm.
Bit better.
So are you gonna do a quick little just like what the series is and we'll be recording and that kind of stuff? Or do you want me to cover that?
I can do that.
Okay. And then I'll go over like upcoming talks and such.
Yeah, I think you've got a slide on that anyway. So,
Yeah.
okay, looking good so far. I got 13. I mean, I like it.
Yeah.
Uh,
I've
Still,
done worse talks to smaller group.
at least they had the link. I don't know why I didn't have the link. I even registered like as a participant, and I don't. Maybe I didn't. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
But
very
that's how I
strange.
got in. Was I went ahead and did the registration, and it recognized me. I think as a um, co co whatever.
Yeah, I tried to re-register and it was like, you're already a host. You can't register. I was like, well, then let me in.
Oh, well, I was registering at the same time I was logging into my UF Zoom, so there's
Hmm.
Carrie. Yeah. And then I was been working on mine for next week all morning. So I was like going back and forth between mine and yours just to see like what like expanding on, the
Yeah.
because there's so much like kind of overlap between these.
Yeah, even mine, I know some stuff Carrie covered in hers, but I was like, people need to hear things a few times anyway.
Oh, definitely.
Hey y'all. Good morning.
Morning.
Ren. Oh, yep, Carrie found her way in. We had the same problem too.
Yeah, I guess I don't know.
I guess because
What?
we're co-hosts, but it wouldn't like I like couldn't find it in my Zoom anywhere.
Oh yeah, I had to just manually, I'd put join and then just manually enter that thing in the meeting ID because it just takes me to the registration page. It's
Yeah.
it's weird. That's not usually what it does. If you're a co-host, it puts you in, but I don't know.
Okie dokie. I'm gonna go ahead and admit.
Okay.
Takes them a minute to get in. Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Thank you for joining us.
Where is my phone?
While we're letting folks in, feel free to add your name and where you're from in the chat if you like. Get to know each other today. I see Central and Key West and Hope Sound. We're all over the place today. Got any Panhandle folks? Alachua County, you guys had some rain here recently. We still do. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. And if you're just joining us today and you weren't with us last week, this is a series that we're doing called Resilient Together, preparing Florida homes and communities. And it's a little bit of an offshoot of a more in-depth program that we do called Climate Smart Floridians. There's a team of us around the state that you'll hear from every Monday from 11 to 12, and Megan's going to be our presenter today. She is a Florida Sea Grant agent in Pasco County, Florida, and we're going to be talking about understanding your risk. If you're interested, at the end of the presentation, there'll be a QR code and a link, or you can reach out to us in the chat if you're interested in holding like a more in-depth version of this that we do called Climate Smart Floridians. It's a 9-module program that really works with residents and community groups to talk about individual climate impacts. And so right now I'm going to turn it over to Megan, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat and providing links. And so if there's anything you need, please reach out to within the chat. And then you may want to open, if you have a tablet or a laptop, a separate Word document to put those links in. If you don't feel like doing that, which is fine, we will send those out after the meeting today. So go ahead, Megan.
Well, thanks everyone for being here today. Hopefully you can see my screen and hopefully you were able to attend last week's talk. But today I'm going to be talking to you about understanding your risk. So again, my name is Dr. Megan Moore and I'm the Sea Grant agent here in Pasco County. So last week we talked about climate resilience, and today we're going to focus on understanding your risk. And after that, if you've understood what risks you may be exposed to, you can stay tuned for our later series where you can learn how to prepare and even adapt your home and your community to these potential risks. So those will be some really great talks coming up. Now, I'd like these talks to be a little bit interactive, so if everyone or people who are interested would like to type a word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of a risk that you have from natural hazards. So this could be an actual natural hazard that you think you deal with, or the impacts that those natural hazards cause around you. So I see floods, fallen trees, tornadoes. Flood's always a big one, right? Wind damage, roof damage, heat. Luckily, a lot of these things I plan on covering today, so I'm glad we're all on the same page. It's glad that we kind of think of the same impacts, power outages, flooding, electrical impacts. All right. Yep. Those are all some really great things. You can continue to add them so other people can think about it, but hopefully we'll kind of all go over those things you're interested in learning about. So when we think about our risk to climate and things that can come from this, there's a lot of different natural hazards that can actually impact our risks. And we want to be resilient to these risks. So being resilient means we're able to prepare, adapt, and actually recover from these risks that come from natural hazards. And I think in this world, moving into the future, being able to be resilient is going to be something that's really important to us. So some of the natural hazards that we really experience a lot here in Florida, hurricanes is always a big one. Heavy rainfall, not just from hurricanes, but major storms that come through. Heat waves or drought, intensified storms, tornadoes, and living in Florida, sea level rise is also one that's pretty impactful for us as we're moving into the future. Now, those natural disasters all lead to some pretty significant impacts. So we saw a lot of people mentioned flooding. I think that's one that's always on the forefront of our minds here in Florida. But the wind damage that can come with these storms, extreme heat, drought, and even fire impacts are something that are really important to consider. And then those impacts that come from those natural disasters are potential damages to our homes and businesses, coastal erosion or habitat loss, damage to our infrastructure. So, not just our homes, but our electrical panels, our water filtration plants, and of course, loss of life, either human or our other environmental animals, things like that, are always something that we have as a potential risk. So, we are here because we want to know what hazards will impact you and what kind of risks you may be exposed to. And so, I have quite a few examples today and maps that you can pull up so that you can understand what kind of risks you're facing and how you can think about how your home may or may not be adapted to these risks. And then next week, we'll go more into what you can do specifically to adapt to them. So, as I mentioned before, hurricanes are going to be one of the biggest risks that come to people's minds when we live in Florida. Unfortunately, we're seeing hurricanes get stronger as the waters warm. Those warm waters fuel our hurricanes. And in the past century, we've seen about a 1 to 3 degree Fahrenheit temperature increase in our waters. So that's just more temperature fuel for these hurricanes. That tends to lead to heavier rain, and the stronger storms lead to higher storm surge that can push that water onto the coast. Now, when you're thinking about understanding your risks, it's important to think about when these risks could happen. So, we have our hurricane season. Technically, hurricane season runs from June 1st to November 30th, but this doesn't mean that's the only time you could potentially experience a hurricane. We actually see them stretching from early May into December. And we've kind of seen an increase in the time span of our hurricanes. We're starting to see them sometimes start even earlier than our hurricane season, and there's been talks about potentially expanding the season. Now, in general, you can get hurricanes anywhere during this time, but we find that most of the risk from hurricanes comes between August and the beginning of November. This is really when the waters are the warmest, and most of our hurricanes form during this time. So you can see in this graph here that August to November window is really when most of our days are filled with tropical storms or hurricanes. So you are potentially at risk earlier and later in the season, but really that August to November time span, and especially the middle of September, is the peak for when you would experience hurricanes. Now, unfortunately, we've also seen an increase in strong hurricanes. So, since the 1920s, you can see kind of a linear incline of hurricane intensity. So, this is category 5 hurricanes that have occurred per decade. And we see that we have a lot more category 5s occurring currently than we used to. So, we're getting more hurricanes and they're getting stronger, which encourages us to think more about the risk that we may have. So this is going to be the first link that we're going to send out. Again, you can feel free to click these links when we send them, but you don't want to get too distracted looking at them on your own. So we will send these links out later if you want to look at them more. But I think a good way to understand your potential risk is to look at where past hurricanes have happened. Now, no hurricane's going to follow the same path every time, but you can kind of see hot spots looking at this map of where hurricanes have seemed to favor in the past. What I want you to remember as well is that just because these single lines represent a hurricane doesn't mean that's the only place the impacts were felt. Hurricanes can be hundreds of miles wide, so just because a hurricane hits in Tampa doesn't mean that's the only place that's going to feel the impacts. So this is just a cool link to go look at where you can see the hurricanes that have happened throughout the past. The image I have on the screen here is showing Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes that have hit Florida. Um, Make sure you're on mute, everyone, just in case. And then if you are interested in looking at some past hurricanes on that link, you can also click on individual tracks. So I clicked on this one, Hurricane Milton from 2024 that impacted us here in the Tampa Bay area, and it'll tell you information about the maximum strength of the hurricane, wind speed, pressure. So if you're looking at any past hurricane or you want to see kind of what the worst impacts that could have happened in your area were, it's a pretty interesting site to look at. I'm a geologist by trade, and we always say that you look at the past to understand the future. So, this is a cool way to look at past hurricanes and predict how you may experience similar impacts if a hurricane were to hit your area. Now, when we think about hurricanes, of course, what we think about is flooding, but it's important to remember that not all flooding is coming from hurricanes. We can get hurricane related flooding, of course, but the impact from flooding will change depending if you live in an inland or coastal community. It can come from something just as simple as excess rainfall. This could just be a front storm coming through. It could be just a thunderstorm happening in the middle of summer. If you were here last week, Carrie talked about just kind of a storm that came through. It wasn't really associated with a hurricane or anything, and it caused significant flooding in her community. Storm surge is another type of flooding that is associated with major storms, and I'll go into some detail on that a little bit later. Sea level rise is causing more high tide flooding, where the slow increase in our sea levels are causing that flooding to happen more frequently on a monthly or yearly basis. And then impacts to our infrastructure. So these are all types of flooding that we're going to consider. As I mentioned before, not all flooding is going to relate to a major storm, although it certainly can. Of course, tropical systems like hurricanes can dump a large amount of water, but those daily storms, the thunderstorms that we see really commonly occurring across Florida in the summer, another type of flooding can be from upstream rainfall. So if you live somewhere that's on a floodplain or located near a strong river, you could have rainfall occurring 50, 100 miles away, and that rainfall is all going to funnel its way into that river or that flood basin, and you can actually have flooding without any rain actually falling in your location. This is one type of sunny day flooding. Another type of sunny day flooding relates to that high tide flooding associated with our rising sea levels and king tides. Um, Another thing to consider when you're thinking about your flood risk is how close you are to a water body. Now, a lot of people just think they're either close to the ocean or they're not, but you can also have a lot of flooding associated with your location compared to a pond, a lake, a nearby river. And if you're in that drainage area related to that. And in some cases, you could be much farther away from a pond than you think would be possible to flood. But if you haven't checked out your elevation or the drainage area that is naturally created to flood in that area, you might not understand that you actually are at risk to flooding. And then, of course, your elevation, so both the ground elevation from that water source that you live near, but also your building elevation. So if you have a second story home, your risk of flooding is going to be much less than your first floor home, of course. I also wanted to kind of share a personal story. Carrie shared hers last week, and that kind of inspired me because I think it has a pretty good ending. So, back in 2012, my childhood home flooded. This was due to a tropical storm. We got about 14 inches of water in our house, and this storm really wasn't predicted to be anything big. If you ask people in my community, I guarantee you almost none of them would remember it because only a couple hundred homes actually experienced flooding like this. And a lot of this came down to the fact that although there was a significant amount of rain that occurred, my home was actually built kind of in the end of the community where all the water drained down into. And we also had a drainage kind of ditch behind our house, and it was not being really maintained by the community. So while this was supposed to help pull water away from this community, it was filling up with plants and debris, and this in some amount related to our flooding. So I wanted to share this because my county had been really great at adapting to this. And we're going to talk about adaptations and things that can be done in the later series. But this was a really good example that I wanted to share. So they actually ended up purchasing several homes in my childhood community, and they tore them down and built this stormwater catchment pond to help kind of relieve some of that flooding, and they maintain it and pump it out regularly before storms are happening. And they also now clean out that drainage pond behind my community and remove all the plant debris and things like that. And even though we've had some pretty significant hurricanes since 2012, this community has not experienced any home flooding since then. So this is just a little kind of pick me up of things that your county or your community can actually make these relatively small changes, and in some cases prevent some of that flooding that happened in the past. So, if you're not sure if you're in an area that could be flooded, the FEMA flood maps are a really great source for this. If you do end up clicking on this link now, you have to zoom in pretty far to your home or your community before the data will load, just because there's so much data on the map. So just keep that in mind. But this FEMA flood map will show you your risk of flooding based on rainfall-based flooding. So something else I want to point out is that the map is based on your 1% annual chance of flooding, which is also called the 100-year flood. And I think a lot of people don't fully understand this term, because when people hear the word, oh, this is a 100-year flood, they think that means that this is only going to occur once every 100 years. And if it happened once, that won't happen again for another 100 years. But really, what it means is that you have about a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. And additionally, say you live in a 100-year flood zone and you buy a house with a 30-year mortgage, you actually have a 26% chance of your home flooding over that 30-year time period. So I think that term kind of confuses people when they hear a 100-year flood. The odds are that you will only flood 1% every year is your odds of flooding. But it can be kind of a confusing term. So when FEMA maps our flood potential, they're mapping the odds of you being in at least a 1% annual chance of flood. So if you were to open this map, which you can look at later, and zoom in on your community, I'm in Pasco County, so I chose an area here in Pasco to focus on. Anything mapped in this light blue area shows an area that has at least a 1% chance of flooding. And then anything in orange is an area that has a 0.2 chance of flooding. So this is a 500-year flood zone, or an area that would flood less than a foot high. So for FEMA's purposes, anything in blue is marked by, again, that 1% annual flood zone, and they require insurance for any homes with mortgages that are in this flood zone. So if you've never looked at this map before, you probably have if you have a mortgage, because then you have to pay flood insurance. But if you haven't, it's really interesting to look at. You can see areas near river basins tend to be in that floodplain. If we zoom into other areas, you can see these communities that you may not have expected to be in a flood zone, but are instead part of that river outfall flooding, so they may not have expected to be in that. If you live near a retention pond, those areas can expand quite a bit during a flood. And even a community that seems rather dry can actually be affected. So, say, for example, you are moving into a community like this one, you might choose to buy a home on the east end of the neighborhood rather than the west end, where you have that higher percent for flooding. So, again, if you haven't looked at this before, it's worth looking at your potential risk for flood. And if you ever plan on moving to a new home, it's definitely worth checking out the risk of flood that you may have before you actually purchase that home. So again, that FEMA map is based on your rainfall flooding potential, but we also, if you live in a coastal area or along a river that connects to the coast, you have a potential for flooding related to storm surge. So when we talk about storm surge is an increase in water level when a storm with strong wind or low atmospheric pressure pushes that water onto land. And while this typically occurs in a coastal area where a hurricane has pushed that water up, we can also see this occurring on larger lakes and areas like that. In general, when we talk about flooding related to storm surge, it can be pretty variable. They consider minor flooding with storm surge to be about 1 to 3 feet, and extreme flooding can be 13 feet and above. And we do see some pretty significant examples of flooding above that 13 feet mark. So if you think about your home, if you live in a coastal community, your home may not be built 13 feet above sea level, so you could easily be flooded by some storm surge. Other things that affect the amount of storm surge are the wind speed and the direction that the hurricane is coming. So our hurricanes spin counterclockwise. So based on if the hurricane is hitting north or south of you, that will push the water either towards the coast or away from the coast. The size of the storm, so the amount of wind that the storm is putting off, will control the height of the storm surge. And even the shape of the coastline can impact how much storm surge you experience in your individual community. If you kind of have a home that or a coastline that narrows into a small area, that water can get pushed up and occur even higher onto shore. In addition to just the elevated height of the flooding that occurs from storm surge, you can also have additional damage due to the wave energy and the tidal energy that's added to this. So things that are going to impact your risk specifically with storm surge is, again, your height. So what your elevation is compared to relative sea level, as well as if your building or your home has been lifted above that potential flood zone or not. What your building or home is made of is really important. When we have this flooding mixed with wave and tide energy, we've had examples of homes being completely washed away if they live along the coast. So modern building codes have been improved for these coastal homes where you have more damage of storm surge and coastal erosion damage. But considering if your home is made of wood or concrete are going to impact your risk from storm surge as well as wind damage, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then, of course, your proximity to the water is going to impact your risk for storm surge. So this is kind of an example of how storm surge could elevate you. So the storm surge is going to be the increased water level from the current tide. So if you have 5 feet of storm surge and it's on top of high tide, that's going to be significantly higher than if the storm surge occurs at low tide. So if the hurricane comes at high tide, your risk of flooding is significantly higher than if the hurricane hits the coast around low tide. And then on top of that just increased storm surge, you can have the wind create larger waves, and the shape of the coastline can cause an additional several feet of apparent flooding height just because those waves can reach further inland and build up a little bit higher. So, just to give you an example, Hurricane Katrina was one of our largest storm surges that we've recorded in the United States. And in southern Mississippi, they actually recorded a storm surge of up to 28 feet. So, that's kind of a mind-boggling amount of water to think about increasing from the current sea level. Um, so sea level rise associated with the storm surge isn't typically this high, but there is potential to have this much amount of storm surge. So it's something to consider. And we talk about evacuation zones. These are the reasons why they will evacuate you when there's risk for storm surge. Now, this is less of a risk, but more of a cool phenomenon. So I just wanted to share it briefly. But because the storm surge is based on kind of the wind direction of the hurricane, depending on where it hits you, we can actually have a reverse storm surge. So in Hurricane Ian in the Tampa Bay, we actually saw the water getting pushed out offshore, and they saw a 7 foot drop in storm surge. So you can have it both pushed up onto land and you can have it sucked away from land. But of course, the being pushed up onto land is the one that causes more potential risk for us. So again, we have another map where you can look up your risk for storm surge. This is again through NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, and this is based primarily on coastal storm surge risk. And when you look into this link, you can see that you choose based on the category of hurricane. So this is the maximum potential storm surge risk that you would have if the hurricane were to hit you directly. Again, depending on if the hurricane hits north or south or directly at your potential home is going to impact the amount of sea level or storm surge. And when a hurricane is coming, your local government will produce specific estimated storm surge maps. So this link that we put in the chat here that you can check out a little later is just based on kind of the highest potential you have. So just so you can think about if the worst hurricane came through, what potentially could happen. So what I want you to look at in this image here, of course, is the coast and the impacts of potential storm surge that you can see. But if you pay attention to the rivers, you'll see how much that water can actually get pushed up into the rivers during this. So this image is a Category 1 hurricane of the Tampa Bay area. This is showing the potential impacts of a Category 3 hurricane, so you can see how much farther inland this storm surge can get pushed and into those riverways. And then in a Category 5 hurricane, the potential flooding impacts that you could have. So again, the odds of a Category 5 hitting you directly and causing this amount of storm surge aren't significantly high, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen. So checking out this website gives you kind of the worst case scenario just so you could potentially prepare for that. Now, I just wanted to briefly touch on sea level. We have seen a pretty significant rise in sea level since the Industrial Revolution. And since the 1800s, 1880, we've actually seen about an 8 to 9 inch rise in our global sea level. And that's a pretty significant rise. And what's associated with this is, although we're going to see those impacts more as we move into the future, the slow impacts that we're seeing right now are associated with our high tide flooding days. So this is when we have those really high tides associated with the balance between where the moon and the sun are, causing our tides to be higher or lower. And as our sea level continues to rise on top of that, we may have roads or communities that were just a few inches away from flooding that are now experiencing this high tide flooding. So here in Pasco County, we have several roads that I see on a monthly basis now getting flooded during those monthly high tide cycles. And so if you're interested in looking at the impacts of sea level rise, this app is kind of just more for visualization, but you can zoom in on your community and change the sea level from what it is currently all the way up to 10 feet, which of course it'll take a while for us to get to 10 feet of sea level rise, but it's really just to show you the impacts that we could see as we continue to move into the future. And then if you go to this link later on, when you click on each of these individual water droplets, it'll show you somewhere in your community what it would look like if you were to raise the water. So this is more of just a visualization. But if you live somewhere like Miami, for example, they are going to be hit in some of the hardest areas for sea level rise as we move into the future. So your home or the home that you may intend to pass down to your children could be impacted by this. And then, of course, think about that storm surge as we add increasing sea level rise risk to that. Okay, so that's enough of flooding for now. We're going to talk about some of our other potential natural hazards. And one of those are tornadoes. So we've actually seen quite a few tornadoes in Florida recently. And as I told you, we have certain seasons where you can have hurricanes. We kind of have seasons for tornadoes. However, the unfortunate thing is that they kind of cover the entire year. So we have the summer season. This is typically June through September, and these are typically more associated with our hurricanes, as well as some of those summer thunderstorms. Tornadoes like to form at the edge of these major storm systems where the calm air is meeting with the area of high or low pressure that's associated with that storm. So when we get that storm that moves through, is that edge period is kind of where those tornadoes tend to form. So we have the summer season hurricanes, but we also have a spring and fall hurricane season that are associated with those cold fronts or low pressure systems that are moving down across the United States. And these ones tend to be the larger, more powerful, and potentially deadly tornado systems. So this is a map of the entire United States and tornadoes that have been tracked over the past 50 years or so. And of course, Tornado Alley in the Midwest of the United States is a hotspot for hurricanes, but Florida is not unscathed. We are pretty well lit up on this map compared to the areas out west, especially. So considering our risks from tornadoes are definitely something that should be counted on when you're thinking about the build of your home and preparing for things like wind damage. So again, this wind damage is going to come from things like hurricanes, tornadoes, and those really strong cold front systems that can come through. When we're talking about the potential damage to your home and the risk that your home may face, there's a few factors that are going to control this. So, is your home an old build or is it a new build? Old homes can be built well, but the new builds have special regulations that they have to kind of fit. We talked before about tie downs for your home, and older homes didn't necessarily regulate if they had to have those tie downs for the roofs or the foundation. So, considering if your home's been upgraded to have some of these tie downs, or if the building codes have changed since your home was built. And things like impact windows can be really important for wind damage as well. So a lot of older homes, I know mine included, still have the very thin single pane windows. But if you're really concerned about wind damage or your potential for boards or things getting lodged through your windows during these strong hurricanes or tornado systems, switching out to impact windows is a really great way to go. And we'll talk more about that in the prepared section. It's also important to consider your exposure to impacts. So I believe when we talked about some of the things that you guys were interested in, some people said falling trees. And that's definitely something that is going to increase your risk. If you have large oak trees or cypress trees or other things around you, that definitely impacts your risk as a lot of these can cause significant damage to your home. Um, when you have non-native trees in your community as well, these trees aren't necessarily grown to be adapted to the strong winds and things that we see. So native trees seem to be a little bit more wind resistant versus our non-native counterparts. Of course, trees can really only stand so much wind, though. So, considering how close you plant a tree to your home or trimming of that tree are going to be significant. And then even things like straight line winds. So if you live in a big open field and there's nothing to interrupt the wind speed, you can have a lot more significant impacts from that wind, things that can blow your roof off more easily or blow things into your home versus if you live in a community where there's a lot of wind buffering from other buildings. So your risk is going to be really dependent on the build of your home the things that can come into contact with your home around you, and if you're buffered from any of this wind. Now, this is really the best map you have to consider flooding and wind damage, although this is generally associated with hurricanes. They don't really make an evacuation map for tornadoes because they can really pop up anywhere, so there's not really a good way to estimate that, and you can't really evacuate for a hurricane. All you or for a tornado, sorry. So for a tornado, really your best bet is to just upgrade your home to the highest build quality you can if that's something that you're super concerned about. But for hurricanes, we do have maps that tell you your risk for flooding and wind damage, and these risks are broken down into evacuation zones. So in these zones, Zone A is the most vulnerable and most likely to be evacuated when you have a hurricane or major storm system coming in, and Zone F is the least likely to be evacuated. And when a storm is coming, this will be up to your local emergency managers or local government to control if they're going to announce your zone to be evacuated or not. So again, if we were to zoom in on an area here, you can see the red or the zone A where you're most likely to be evacuated is typically closest to the coast. Remember, this is based purely on flooding risk. That can be storm surge as well as rainfall flooding, but more storm surge in this case, as well as the potential for wind damage to make its way inland. So that's why it's mostly focused along the coast. And it's also important to remember that if you live somewhere that is an evacuation zone and you choose not to evacuate, the local police and firefighters are not allowed to come in and get you out of a harmful situation while that evacuation zone is lifted or until the conditions are safe enough for them to do so. So if you're in an area that's zone A, for example, and a storm surge comes and traps you in your home with a 10-foot storm surge, the police or firefighters are not going to be able to come and rescue you until it's deemed safe for them to do so. So if you think about staying, it's important to consider how you can take care of yourself if help cannot come to you and the potential risk that that could pose for others. Now, this risk map also gives you the evacuation routes. So if you're not too familiar with how you would escape or leave your evacuation zone if you lived in one of these areas, it's worth checking out this map to see what the quickest and safest evacuation zones are. And these are generally based on roads that have the least risk for flooding, highest potential for kind of allowing that traffic to move through and things like that. Okay, so one of the last areas of potential risk we're going to talk about is related to temperature and drought. So we've seen pretty significantly rising temperatures since the really early Industrial Revolution, where since the 1880s, we've seen almost a 2.5 degree Fahrenheit rise in our average global temperature. And what this really leads to is our impacts associated with increased heat and drought. And this is really occurring across the entire United States and even really across the world. But we are seeing these impacts in Florida as well. Some of these biggest impacts are related to health risks. If you're an outdoor worker, you've probably already noticed these rising temperatures and the impacts that they're having. My dad works in the outdoor realm, and he's definitely impacted by these kind of impacts to heat. We are seeing increased sunburn, heat exhaustion, and for our populations that don't have homes, we have started to have to set up, in addition to the typical cold shelters, we're setting up heat shelters now where people can go and actually be relieved of these potential risks due to extreme temperatures. We're also seeing, because of this drought and increased heat, wildfire increases. So we have risk from wildfires spreading across Florida. We're starting to see infrastructure failure. So roads can actually start to melt in extreme cases. But really, our biggest infrastructure impact are that our electrical grids can't necessarily keep up with the demand for energy as people are trying to cool their homes. That puts um, a lot of draw on our energy grids that can actually cause them to shut down if they're overused because they're just not built to sustain these energy needs. Of course, we're seeing impacts in water availability. This is impacting our ability to water our crops. Our rivers are running low. Our springs are pumping out less water than they used to. And in addition to the lack of water with our crops, these warmer temperatures can stress the plants more, reduce our food yields, and pests are actually more likely to target your crops when we have these increased temperature and humidity. So as I was making this presentation, I actually came across this article where we, across the United States, actually have 17 states that are already under emergency orders to reduce their use of power because it's going to cause blackouts in their community. So these people are using their AC to draw down temperatures because it's so hot outside, and that's putting such a tax on their electrical grids that the electrical grids could actually fail. So things like this are going to become increasingly common as we move into the future, as our infrastructure isn't necessarily built to accommodate these changes. Now you can look at your potential heat risk. So these are just shared in the chat now. Now this heat risk map is going to change on a daily basis. So if you're an outdoor worker, for example, or you're planning on taking your kids out to play or your dog on a walk, this might be something that you're interested in looking at before you go outside or spend a trip to the park or something like that. And it'll tell you your potential risk for heat-related health risks. Another thing that we can look at is the drought across Florida. So these are generally made with the help of the water management districts. So we have several water management districts across Florida, and they're the ones maintaining the use of water with our agricultural departments and our cities and individual people who have wells, things like that. But they also monitor our rainfall levels to assess how much drought we've had. So currently, all of Florida, apart from a few key areas, are still in a drought, meaning we haven't had enough water in the water year. I know it's been raining a lot lately, especially where I live, but we are still considered to be in a drought because we still have not made up for the lack of water that we had during the dry season and into last year's water year. So as we continue thinking about drought, we have to continue to check what's impacting us and how we can kind of cope with this. So, for our fire risk, if you are concerned, if you live in an area where you have a lot of wildlife, you could potentially have fire risk around you. Again, it's worth considering what your home is made of. Is it a wood-based home or a concrete-based home? Of course, if a fire comes, it's going to be hard to kind of combat an extreme fire no matter what, but obviously a concrete home would be better to be resistant to this fire related impacts. But there's also home upgrades you can do, things like upgrade your windows to be fire safe, the siding on your home and your roof can actually be upgraded to fire safe materials. Um, for your landscaping, if you're concerned about fire risk, there's actually been cases where people have turned on their sprinkler systems when a fire was coming through, and in some cases, it's actually protected their home from these fires. You can plant rocks instead of easy to burn plants or create defensible zones where you have kind of set amount of distance between your home and the natural world around it. So keeping things that are flammable like leaves, pine needles away from the closest areas to your house, spacing out trees, things like that. And again, we'll go into more detail about how you can prevent your risk in later talks. And then I know it can be kind of controversial, controlled burns, but if they're being done right and the state or your local government are maintaining the wild areas, controlled burns are an efficient way of removing a lot of that leaf litter, pine needles, and things that can spark easily, and it reduces our risk of wildfires from occurring that are uncontrolled. Lastly, when we consider drought, again, human health impacts and related to drought and heat are going to be one of our most significant things. So the more you can stay hydrated, of course, drinking water is good, but I think a lot of people don't realize you should also increase your electrolyte intakes because you need those electrolytes to help your body process the water. Avoid the heat and sun when possible. I think it's also important to consider our pets. If you have a dog you walk often, think about the temperature of the concrete or the outside area. And then using sun protection is going to become increasingly important as we move into the future. We have quite a high risk of developing melanoma or skin cancer here in Florida. So using sunscreen, sun shirts, things like that are going to increase your safety when you're thinking about your personal risk to things like heat. When we're thinking about drought, limiting your water use is going to be really important for the sake of the entire state. So we have Florida-friendly landscaping principles that you can follow. These will teach you things like how to install drought-tolerant plants that use very little water. They'll teach you how to do things like use efficient watering on your lawns. You can upgrade your home to low-flow appliances. If you still have toilets in your house that are from the 70s and 80s, they use way more water than the new upgraded toilets do. So you might want to consider upgrading to those. And follow your local watering guidelines. Your local water management district will tell you how much water to use. If you're in a drought, what days you can water your lawn, things like that. And all of our individual efforts to conserve water make an impact to the greater state as a whole. And then lastly, because of these potential energy grid failures, of course, using less energy is great. You can upgrade to energy efficient microwaves, stoves, air conditioning units, but also upgrading your home. So installing things like those double paned windows, those can now protect you against wind damage, heat, insulation, even fire damage if you upgrade those. So those are all just little things you could do that could decrease your risk. So, kind of in summary, when you're thinking about your risk, the best thing you can do is really ask questions and stay informed. It's great you already came to this talk, so you can start understanding your risk. If you're moving to a new area, talk with your realtor or your neighbors. Has this home been flooded? What kind of windows have been upgraded? Check with your local government, see if they have a resiliency plan or if it's something that they're thinking about. Unfortunately, it does come down to you and your responsibility to research your potential risk, as it can sometimes be difficult to get that information without looking it up yourself. But looking at things like your home building materials, your elevation, and checking all these risk maps that we've provided you with today will really help you understand the risk that you have. And then if you stick with us for the future talks, you can learn things about how to prepare more for these potential hazards. We have some great talks about adapting your home, so adding green or gray infrastructure to be prepared. And then, of course, advocating in your community to create a resilient community that can be involved is always really important to help reduce our risks across the entire state. So we've done the first two talks now. Again, we'll get into prepare and recover for these risks next week, and then some of our green and gray infrastructure impacts. If you're interested in doing a more involved program, we do have our Climate Smart Floridian program that we offer that goes more into little impacts you can do to help reduce your green impacts. And if you're interested in more, you can always contact your local extension office. So, with that, thank you. If you have any questions, I'm not sure if we got any in the chat or if you have any you'd like to ask, I'd be happy to try to answer some.
We have one question, Megan, and a couple of comments. Celia asked if you know, is anyone in Florida thinking about cooling shelters? And she says that it seems that with all our humidity and hazardous wet bulb temperatures, that may be happening sooner than other parts of the country.
Yep. So I know in Pasco County, and I can't necessarily say for the other counties, but I'm sure they do. We do have cooling or heat shelters. So similar to when we have the cold fronts come through, we open up warming shelters to give people a place to stay. We do offer cooling shelters when temperatures get up in the 90s for sustained periods of time, and that offers a cool place where people can go and cool down. So that's definitely something that I think is going to become more and more important and used as we move into the future.
And then a couple of comments, and I went ahead and launched the poll while we're going through these comments. So if you see something come up that says poll, feel free to fill it out. It helps us, determine whether we met the mark today. So Janice from Melbourne, Florida, offered a couple of comments. Folks can scroll up the chat or I can tell you how to get there. She asked if we worked at all with AmericanResiliency.org. I wasn't able to pull it up on my computer, but there may be a firewall issue on that. Have you heard of them at all, Megan, or used that website?
I have not personally used it yet, but I'm always looking for more great resources. So I can definitely check it out and we can probably add it to the link for everyone when we send out the rest of the links later this week.
Great. And then Janice also offered an organization called Job One for Humanity, JOBONE for humanity.org. And I was able to pull that up. Super interesting website, and it looks like they do a lot of good work.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing, Janice. Again, I haven't heard of that one either, but I'm always looking for more that we can benefit from, and I'm sure everyone else in the chat would like to learn more about that as well.
That was it. I am answering Melissa, who said who's asking who to contact for the more in-depth option. So I put my email in there, and I can help connect any of you if you are interested. We can talk about what that in-depth option looks like. I can connect you to our statewide team. We've done that more in-depth option in person and online. So, I know several agents have done it via their local library or other groups that, had an interest in it. I'm happy to, talk about that. Just shoot me an email. And that's all the ones that I saw.
Does anyone have any questions that they wouldn't like to put in the chat? You can unmute if you'd like to ask one. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We look forward to you coming next week. Hopefully, you can make it. It'll be really interesting learning how you can prepare for these risks as we move into the future.
I think I think Holly gets the poll data. I might get it too, but I think if not, maybe I'll write it down just in case. It's always a
Yeah,
risk, right?
yeah, it's always good to have.
Let me write it down before I jump off of here. Um, is 25 out of 26. 96%. Two is 16 out of 26. 2%. Carrie, do you know, did you get the poll data last time?
I got the meeting notes.
Okay.
I don't remember getting the poll data.
Right.
But the meeting notes like saved. I don't know if everybody else got those or not.
Might have.
Yeah, I
But I
got
knew
the
Holly
meeting.
had. Yeah, I knew
Okay.
Holly was on, so I didn't really pay any attention to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have everybody lined up for our talks?
I'm gonna stop the recording, okay?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, it says you want to stop recording to the cloud, right? I think that's normal.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want it